Welcome back to Obsession Engineering for a nice short little job on the SP1, because today I'm changing the chain and sprockets. So the rear sprocket on my SP1 actually looks okay. The teeth are in reasonable condition. According to the guide on the swinging arm, the chain is in good condition as well. There is a more accurate way to test my stretch measurement on the chain, and that's with my stretch measuring tool though. So with the biking gear and just a little bit of load against the chain, I'm just going to hook the chain stretch measuring tool onto there, and yeah, that's absolutely fine. Because we don't even go onto the green, the chain stretch apparently is absolutely fine. This tool is very, very useful and basically works with any 5 series chain. So 520, 525, 530, 532, and it basically gives you a good guide as to whether the chain is stretched in a reasonable position or whether it's absolutely cream crackered. So real quick, easy way to check if your chain's stretched. Chain stretch is not the only reason a chain might fail though. If it's been badly put together, and if I'm honest by the state of the plate on here, I think when this has been riveted over, it has not been done particularly nicely. So that is definitely not up to my standard. There is also a bit of a frozen link issue going on here. If I try and move it, you see this link doesn't really, it's a bit stiff and it just doesn't sit particularly well. And the other thing that actually, the number one reason for chains breaking is actually corrosion. And although this one isn't corroded visually, of course we don't really know what's underneath. So I'm not going to risk it. I'm just going to cut this one off, change the chain and the sprockets. To replace my chain and sprockets of unknown era, I've got a really high quality Zubaki Sigma chain and some steel JT sprockets. I went with steel because basically they last a little bit longer than alley rear sprockets, so I don't need to worry about it. I wanted original size because I'm not racing this bike, so the tiny little advantage you get from a smaller pitch chain like a 520 isn't an advantage to me really, and this will just give me a tiny bit extra longevity. The steel rear sprocket also gives me the slightly more original look, which I quite like. I have not gone for a smaller front sprocket. It's really common on these bikes because the gearing's standardly quite tall for people to put a smaller front sprocket on it. But there are two things that I didn't want to do with that. Firstly, I actually don't dislike the long gearing. You just run a shorter gear everywhere and you just get used to riding it like that. But really my big thing was the chain guide, as in the rubber guide that sits on the swinging arm. They're really, really prone for wearing out if you put the 16-tooth front sprocket on, because the chain actually cuts into the guide a little bit, and you can't buy them from Honda anymore. And so I don't want to wear through this one and then start wearing the swinging arm, so I'm sticking with a standard size front sprocket, and if I ever decide that I do want to change the gearing a little bit, I'll actually go bigger on the rear sprocket instead. Before I get too excited and start hacking the chain off the bike though, I'm going to undo all the sprocket nuts, because it's much easier to do it while everything's solid and together, especially at the front. But before I can undo the sprocket nut, I actually need to take the cover off, so bear with me a moment. With the front sprocket cover removed and just hung out of the way a little bit, it's time to undo stuff. Now, I don't actually use an impact gun very often on a motorbike, but there are certain times when it's really useful, and sprocket nuts tend to be tight, so get an impact gun on them and just buzz them off. Easy. There are a selection of very clever tools available for pushing the pins out of here and de-riveting your chain, but none of them work as well as an angle grinder, a chisel and a hammer. So we're going old school on it. All I do with the grinder is sort of take the head off the rivet, so it's nice and flush, and then I'm just going to get the chisel behind the plate, in between the side plates of the main link and the outer link, and basically knock the plate off. Then the chain will just fall apart. So with the heads ground off and the side plate basically chiselled out the way, we can take the links apart. And the fact that that doesn't just slide out really easily tells me that there's a reason why these links were sticking a little bit. And that is actually quite solidly in there. And that tells a bit of a story. You can see a little bit of rust on there, so obviously at some point it's been overly clean. It might have been jet washed or something, and it's pushed a little bit of water in between the links, in between the O-rings. And if you look on the lower link there, you can actually see where it's actually worn a section of the link away. So we've got a bit of a step down here, and that's obviously quite critical chain wear. So it wasn't excessive over the length of the chain to actually cause the chain to stretch, because realistically that's what actually causes the stretch, but obviously it's not an ideal situation, and that would have failed a little earlier than expected. So I'm pleased we're changing that. And this is an excellent opportunity as well to get in and clean 18,000 miles of old chain lube and smeg and dirt from inside the swinging arm, because that is not up to the Dave standard of clean. Definitely not. But before I get too deep into the cleaning, I'm going to take the back wheel out. Obviously I need the back wheel out to take the rear sprocket off, and it means I can get in and clean the inside of the swinging arm as well, so I can do all of my cleaning in one go. Big breaker bar. Get the rear sprocket undone. It is supposed to be tight because of all the things you don't want coming undone on your motorbike. Wheels and brakes is fairly high on my list. So we shall get the nut and all the spacers and bits out. That's a little bit tight, so of course I should go and get a hammer, but it moves relatively easy, so I just use the plastic end of my tool. But don't tell anybody. And then what I like to do to support the weight of the wheel is to get my foot underneath it, so I can just sort of jiggle it with my toe, and then I don't have to like lift the weight of the wheel with my arm and try and get the spindle out at the same time. So spindle out. Because it's a top mount caliper, you can come backwards a little bit and basically lower your foot back down to the floor. Take the caliper and its hanger mount out and just leave them down there. Take the spacers out, and then we can put the wheel on the floor and change the sprocket. And because I've already taken my nuts off, this section's really quite straightforward. Take the sprocket off, put the sprocket on. Although before I put it on completely, I'm going to give the wheel and all around the hub a bit of a clean. So now that everything is looking considerably cleaner, and I have saved about 12 kilograms in chain lube dirt alone, it's time to get the back wheel back in. The rear sprocket nuts I've done up tight already. I will admit they're one of the few facets on this bike that do look a little bit past their best, so they might well get changed at some point. The front sprocket one, firstly I'm not quite so bothered about the cosmetics of it because I can't see it, but I will tighten that one up when we've got the chain on, because obviously it's a lot easier to hold it in place with something mechanical to hold it in place. So next thing to do is thread the new chain on. So I'm just going to feed the chain onto the rear sprocket and very carefully turn it round so you don't trap your fingers in anything. If I still had the old chain on, what I could do is link the two chains together and use the old chain pulling out to pull the new chain in. But being as I've got sprocket covers and everything off to, well, change the sprockets, I have got reasonably good access to actually just get in here and feed the new chain in. Obviously, when I get to the end, I can't quite get the two ends of the chain together, which means I need to actually slacken the adjusters off and push the wheel forward a bit. So I have my new rivet link. I've just slipped a couple of the X-rings on it, and I want to make sure there's plenty of lubrication, plenty of grease on the pins, which there is. Now this is an X-ring chain, so they're like O-rings, but basically they've got double the sealing surface. So once there's grease in the links, it should stay in there relatively well, and when you're lubing your chain, you're mostly lubing where the chain runs against the sprocket. A little bit of the lube might get into the link, but basically you want to make sure you've got a load of grease on the rollers before you put it together. Then once the link is pushed through the chain, obviously there's another pair of O-rings, and then we're going to need the external rivet. And then these pins are absolutely solid ends. Some are slightly hollowed out and require a tool to peen them over from the inside to like push them over, to mushroom them. These we're going to hit with a very special tool, a hammer and an actual chain riveter. I've pushed the side plate on and given it a little bit of a nip with a pair of pipe grips just to get it started on the pins, and then I'll need my whale chain tool. So that just locates on there, and then we'll get the pipe grips on the go again, and at a slightly odd wrist angle so you can actually see what I'm doing. I'm just going to tighten the side plate up like this, and basically that pushes the side plate onto the chain link. the link is now pushed properly onto the pins, and it's got to go on far enough that it puts a tiny bit of pressure on the seal so that it actually keeps the moisture out and the grease in the link, but not too much that it crushes the link and makes it basically freeze in place. So it's a case of just nip it up by bit and compare it to the other links. But I'm happy with that now. We've got a reasonable bit of standoff on the pins, so the next thing we need to do is basically splay them over. To splay the ends over, we're going to be using this attachment on the chain riveting tool. So basically we'll tighten that up so it holds the link tight, slide the riveting bit of the tool in, and it just sticks out the end there just enough that when we hit it with a hammer, this will just basically, the end of this will just mushroom the pin over slightly. So with my tool set up, with the pin like the rivety bit at the top there, just so I know where we are, I get to use my favourite tool, which is my Thor half copper half hide 2-pound hammer. I love this tool. So nice solid blow on that, and I can just feel already it's started to rivet it in that plane. So we'll do a second one there, and then we'll turn the tool round 90 degrees. And I like to do 2 in each place, and I can feel that's locating. Right, first rivet riveted. And hopefully you can see on there where it's actually flattened the corners off and basically mushroomed the end over. Almost exactly the same as on the rest of the links. That one I haven't done yet, so you can see the difference. Nice and circular, not circular at all. So once I've riveted that up, that link is not coming off. That plate is now definitely not coming off, so the only thing left to do now really is set the tension, and that's a little bit slack at the moment, tighten up my front sprocket nut, tighten the wheel up, sprocket cover back on, job sorted. This is the alternative type of link you might come across, with the slightly hollowed out ends in it. And instead of hitting this with a chain tool to hammer the edges over like that, what you have is you have a special tool with basically a ball end that pushes into here and actually splays it out from the inside. And you don't hit it with a hammer, you actually screw it together. This basically puts less stress on the link, and some links are designed to be done like this. And that's another bit finished on my SP1, and I'm now considerably more confident that that chain and sprocket is ready for a chunk more fast mileage. I'm also quite pleased that I've had a chance to go and clean inside things, because that's made my OCD a lot better. And remember, just because you can't see it doesn't mean you can't clean it. A little bit like your bum, some places should just be clean. So thank you for watching, and join me again next time for the last bit of SP1 action.